years, so you should be pretty well submitted by now.
I'm almost there. I
Okay.
changed to part-time when COVID hit again this year. So
Okay, so that's fair enough. So you can probably got yourself a bit more time there. Anyway, the thing is that Matt picked on this project, and it was a very good project because there are lots of brush turkeys around. But I think the thing that really turbocharged this was when he won the Australian Citizen Science Association prize, which was a few years ago now. But he was then able to develop an app which made it easy for people to send records to him. And it's one of those things. You're doing a PhD, you have to do all the work yourself. He's doing it through the University of Sydney, through ecology, I think. And it's always great to be able to have that extra input of data. And I think he'll tell us a bit about that. I'd have to say there are a lot of brush turkeys around now. Around Hunters Hill, there certainly are. They sort of walk up and down the street. In fact, we had one on our roof probably only a few days ago. Without further ado, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us again, Matt, and please take it away.
thank you, Tom, for having me back, and thank you to all of you for inviting me back again. I'll just share my screen, and hopefully you can all see my presentation now.
Yep.
So I know some of you have heard me talk before, so I'll be going over a bit of background on brush turkeys, so that's not going to be new. But hopefully there'll be lots and lots of new data and information and interesting brush turkey stories to share. So I always start off by talking about the history of the spread of brush turkeys. And although they might seem common now, this definitely was not always the case. So I've just picked 4 different quotes from different newspapers and magazines showing that there was this really common perception that brush turkeys were increasingly rare and by the early 20th century may have even been heading towards extinction. And a lot of this comes from overhunting. So they were eaten by indigenous people and the first European settlers, but hunting pressure really peaked during the Great Depression, when they were a convenient food source for people who might not have had much else. Of course, this has changed now, and I love showing this sequence of maps, just pointing out where brush turkeys have been observed over the last 20 years or so. And this was when I started my PhD, and you can see they have spread all throughout the North Shore of Sydney and moved into the south across the harbour, and they're coming down from the Blue Mountains. So this is a remarkable change from a bird that was heading towards extinction. And of course, now you have brush turkeys turning up in the most unexpected and unusual places. So right in the middle of the city, in gardens and backyards, in the sidewalks and streets, and inside buildings. And of course, whenever you have wildlife and people in such close proximity, you have a butting of heads and serious conflict between residents and wildlife. So I love these photos of a brush turkey male in the top left, which is attacking his reflection in someone's windscreen. He thinks it's another rival male. You have 2 examples of these enormous nest mounds, in this case, swallowing someone's swing set. And of course, you have brush turkeys becoming road hazards as they walk across the road and drag all this material to make their nests. And as unusual as that is, I have to point out it is both remarkable and really interesting to people like myself, urban ecologists, because cities are actually really challenging environments for most different species. Cities present challenges like potentially competing with introduced species. In Australia, they include cats and foxes, for example, that might also act as new predators. They also have to deal with the loss of their native habitat and the remaining green spaces that can often be really patchily scattered throughout the city. And of course, there are new dangers like road traffic and chemical and sensory pollution that animals have to deal with. But those that can find lots and lots of new resources and new opportunities, such as empty niches waiting to be exploited when other species can't make it. They might find escape from their natural predators, which have been driven out of cities. and they can often find abundant resources, water, and a pretty stable environment because we humans like to keep cities pretty stable for ourselves. So a common thread in urban ecology research is to look at what kind of animals can survive in cities. And these are examples of traits that are common to urban birds. I use the noisy miner here as a great example of a bird which is just thriving in cities. And these traits can include a high dispersal ability. They have to be non-migratory, so they can not only move between these scattered patches of habitat, but keep them all year round against potential competitors and threats. They have to have a broad environmental tolerance and be tolerant of disturbance because they're going to be exposed to lots of unique conditions that will not be present in the natural habitat. And they have to be omnivorous and really adaptable in their diet so they can take on whatever opportunities and resources they might find in the city, such as the food that we provide for them or leave behind. And of course, they can't just survive in the cities, they have to reproduce to perpetuate the species. So whatever their reproductive system is, has to be able to be adapted to an urban environment. So I'll talk briefly about brush turkeys in general, and then return to the question of whether brush turkeys make a typical urban bird. So they are widely distributed. They can be found naturally from Cape York down to the Illawarra on the east coast. They are omnivorous, eating whatever they come in contact with, but naturally they will eat fruits, seeds, and other plant parts. They'll eat invertebrates, and they'll scavenge on carrion and small vertebrates if they find them. And they are mostly ground foraging. They will roost socially in trees at night, but otherwise most of their life is spent on the ground. And to match this, they are pretty strong runners, but they are very weak flyers. They can't fly long distance. They are pretty individual animals. They don't form permanent groups, but they will occasionally form loose foraging groups that mostly consist of females because the males tend to be quite territorial. So, of course, what sets brush turkeys apart from other birds and gets a lot of the ire and complaints about the species is this incredible nest mound, which will weigh on average up to 3 tons. And that's because the nest mounds are actually natural incubators. And because all that leaf litter and organic material breaks down, producing the heat that will incubate their eggs. So to build the mound takes approximately 40 days. And in doing so, the male will rake leaf litter from a pretty wide area surrounding the mound, up to 150 meters in some cases, and he'll maintain it for the rest of the breeding season, which is from July to February the next year. And then while they may build more than one throughout the season, they'll usually have a main nest, which they'll stick to by the end of the season. The females, their contribution to the reproductive process of the species is to produce these very large and very yolk-filled eggs. So the brush turkey eggs are about 180 grams, so 2 to 3 times the size of a chicken egg, and they can be up to 50% yolk in some cases. So a really, really rich food source for their chicks. And females will lay, on average, 18 to 20 eggs in a season, but that number can widely vary depending on how fit and successful the female is. And they'll choose the mate based on the quality of the mound. So what they're really looking for is a good nest mound to lay their eggs in. And all that effort from the females results in highly precocious and really well-developed chicks. Once they hatch, it takes them about 2 days to dig their way out of the mound. But once they do, they live fully independent from their parents. They can run and fly, recognize food and each other, and they can travel quite long distances. But unfortunately, they have quite a high mortality. Over 90% of chicks will die within the first few weeks, and this is mostly due to predation. But if they survive full 10 months, they reach adult size. So with that out of the way, coming back to our brush turkeys, typical urban birds, and we find they're kind of a mixed bag. They are non-migratory, and they do have a broad environmental tolerance because they're found from the tropics right down to southern New South Wales, and they are omnivorous. But they don't have what we would consider to be a high dispersal ability, at least compared to other birds. they're not going to fly long distances across the city to find the right kind of habitat for them. And we don't know, at least we didn't know, whether they're tolerant of disturbance. So how will they deal with traffic, with people, with noise and light, and all the different sources of disturbance they'll find in the city? And how adaptable is their diet and reproductive system to living in cities? So you might have seen this slide before if you've attended one of my talks. And these are just different theories that I had heard about why brush turkeys are spreading in urban areas. And I think they all contribute to the story somewhat, but none of them on their own can explain why brush turkeys have been so successful. And I'll go into that a bit more in a moment. So the key questions I had at the start of my PhD were, what is the distribution of brush turkeys in Sydney in particular, and how and where are they moving through the city? Secondly, how are they using the different kind of habitats available in the city? Because a city contains a lot of different kind of habitats, from gardens to parks to streets, and there could be a lot of difference in a really small scale between habitats. Thirdly, how are they behaving differently? Has becoming an urban bird changed their behavior from what we consider to be natural? And lastly, what are their environmental effects and ecological role in cities? So this is a map in a bit more detail showing how brush turkeys have moved into Sydney and Brisbane since 1960. And you can see in Sydney, they started off in the northwest, kind of disappeared from there into the 1980s, but then appeared in the north part of the city. And then suddenly, in the last 20 years, they've spread all throughout the north shore of the city, coming up from the south, coming down from the west. So suddenly, brush turkeys are everywhere. And it's a fairly similar story in Brisbane, starting off mainly in the west, but then spreading inwards from all directions, and now they're all over the city. And in this map, the darker areas represent higher numbers of brush turkey sightings. And I decided I would try to look at what areas brush turkeys have been moving into over time. So I was able to find satellite imagery from each of those 20-year time periods and looked at what was the land that brush turkeys were moving into like. And I found out that over time, they were moving into progressively more suburban and more urban areas with less of a natural vegetation and more, I guess, open lawn vegetation. So over time, they've been moving into more suburban areas with less and less vegetation. And it seems like this trend is continuing. So the first thing we thought of doing to track their movements in urban areas was GPS tagging. So to do this, we caught the brush turkeys, we fitted them with a little backpack that had a GPS transmitter on it, and we let them go. And we thought this would be a great way to track their movements in the long term. The GPS was solar powered, so it should last indefinitely. It'd be a great idea. It didn't quite work out that way because it turns out solar power doesn't work well if they're hiding under the trees all the time. And when the battery ran out and we thought we need to go collect the GPS transmitter, turns out the brush turkeys have disappeared and were nowhere to be found. And I'll explain more about that later on. But it was still a great pilot study, and we got a sense of exactly how brush turkeys are moving throughout the city. So the map on the top left is the path taken by a bird we tagged in Balgala, and we tagged it in this little reserve here, and it spends a lot of the time in the reserve, but also moves in and out of these apartment blocks, across some pretty major roads, and this is all in its daily foraging path. So it was coming into lots of different habitats in its daily routine. This bird we tagged in Taronga Zoo in one of the picnic areas down here. But what it did was moved back and forth between the zoo and the national park adjacent to Sydney Harbour. And it would roost in the national park, but forage in Taronga Zoo every day. And that gave us pretty good indication that the birds you see in the reserves are probably going to be the same birds you're seeing in the streets. And similar story of this bird we tagged in Cremorne Point, though it spent most of his time in this little narrow reserve. But I'll come back to the story of this pretty unique bird later on. So GPS was a miss, but our next idea involved a lot more citizen science. So the Wing Tags project has already been running for a few years, And you might have seen wing-tag ibis or cockatoos around, and this is part of the same project. The idea behind that is to catch birds and fit them with these really obvious wing tags with numbers on them, and then people can send in their sightings over really long time periods, and we can see how these individual birds are moving over really long periods of time. And that helps us answer questions like, what is the brush turkey's territory size? What are their long-term movements like? And how likely are they to stay in the same area we tag them in? And to date, we have 96 tagged brush turkeys in Sydney. So this is what we found for most birds. Pulled out 3 males and 3 females as examples, but most of them have a pretty small home range, 1 kilometre radius perhaps, and they don't tend to leave that. And they'll forage and they'll roost and they'll build their nest mounds within this pretty small range. But we found a few exceptions. Some birds we found moved incredibly long distances. So our record to date is bird number 97, which we tagged in the University of Sydney, which has recently been spotted in Oatley. So that's a more than 15K journey, and we know it moved on its own because we received several sightings of it in different parks along the way. So it wasn't relocated, which was our first thought, and is now happily settling in Oatley. And it made this journey over a period of about 2 weeks, and we know that it would have had to have walked. It can't possibly have flown that distance or even flown in short hops. And this is common enough that we know that several of these birds will make these long distance journeys. And to this day, we don't know what triggers them to make these journeys, just that they'll do it. Because again, to take this bird as an example, it had been in Sydney Uni and the surrounding suburbs for several months before moving to Oatley and has now been there for the last few months. And if you remember the bird we tagged in Cremorne Point, he now lives in Balmoral. So, and this, we originally hypothesized this would be something that males would be doing because males are territorial, and so they might have to look for new territories. But it turns out that both males and females will make this long distance journeys. And we did some digging, and it turns out this has never been observed in brush turkeys before. So up until now, we had no idea that they would ever do this. And we're still trying to dig into exactly why they make these movements, but that's probably going to take a few more years of observation to find out. So moving on to the question of, does city life change brush turkey behavior? And the test I used for this is something called flight initiation distance. And that's really simply, when will an animal move to escape something that is approaching it? And it's a great measure of how bold and how tolerant of disturbance the animal is. And it's actually really important that a species can fine-tune their flight distance to their environment. Because if they flee too early at the earliest sign of danger, that's taking a lot of, firstly, energy, but also reduces the time they have to forage, to reproduce, to socialize. It takes time away from all their other behaviors. Whereas if they flee too late, a potential predator may obviously catch them. And that is also detrimental to their other behaviors. So a species should, in theory, be able to adjust this to their environment. And I was wondering, had brush turkeys adjusted their flight initiation distance in response to humans in an urban environment? So it was a simple method of me approaching brush turkeys in these different kind of habitats and recording when they would move to escape me as a potential threat. And I hypothesized that the birds in cities would have to get used to humans and at some point stop considering them a threat to be able to survive in cities. And this is generally what we found. So in this graph, the more urban habitats, so gardens, streets, and lawns, brush turkeys had a very short FID, meaning I was able to approach them really closely before they moved to escape me. Whereas birds in more vegetated habitats, whether they were their natural environment in national parks or vegetated reserves, they move to escape much quicker, much sooner. And this tells me that brush turkeys are habituating to humans. They've started to no longer see humans as a threat in urban areas. And the fact that their FID is still quite high in natural areas tells me that's a very recent development that's unique to the urban brush turkeys and not something that's evolved into their species. So the other thing I wanted to look at was, how do brush turkeys fit in to their ecosystem? And I was cued onto this idea after receiving lots of emails from people who swore that brush turkeys dramatically change the soil and ground cover and leaf litter in areas that they move into. So an example is Rosemary, who used to have a very sandy and waterlogged garden until brush turkeys moved in, and within a few months the soil was aerated and beautifully mulched and ready to grow anything as soon as they stopped digging up all their plants. Fran was a bush care worker who told me that the brush turkeys in the local area did a great job of clearing all the weeds, so trad and chickenweed, and they would just bury the weeds in his nest mound and made their job a lot easier. Lastly, Nick was a Blue Mountains resident who told me that he believed brush turkeys helped reduce the spread of low-intensity bushfires by gathering all this leaf litter and leaving large areas of bare ground that made it very difficult for the fires to spread. And he thought that over long periods of time, this was pushing the plant communities more towards wet sclerophyll. So what I did was I buried leaf litter bags, so mesh bags containing leaf litter around brush turkey nests, to look at whether the activity of brush turkeys affected the rate the leaf litter would decompose. And what I found was pretty interesting. So in the non-breeding season, we didn't really find a pattern. The leaf litter just kind of decomposed evenly. But in the breeding season, there was an obvious pattern related to the distance from the brush turkey nest. The closer the leaf litter was buried to the brush turkey nest, the faster it would decompose. And this tells us that all the turnover of the leaf litter brush turkeys are doing is speeding up the decomposition, and this is related to their breeding activity. We also found they were simply moving a lot of these leaf litter bags. It might not be a case of them affecting decomposition at all, simply removing the leaf litter entirely. And we found, again, in the non-breeding season, there was a pretty even spread of litter bags removed from the different distances, but in the breeding season, almost half the bags I put down were stripped by the brush turkeys close to the nest, and that number was reduced further and further away from the mound. So the further away you get from the nest mound, the less intense the effect of the brush turkeys on the leaf litter becomes. The other way they interact with their environment, of course, is the way they interact with other species. So I was interested in what other animals were interacting with brush turkeys in and around their nest mounds. So I put cameras on several brush turkey mounds throughout the city and in Ku-ring-gai National Park. And these are pictures of some animals that I saw on brush turkey nests. So you had animals like lyrebirds in Ku-ring-gai National Park and swamp wallabies. In the cities, animals like bandicoots and red foxes were much more common. So these are where I put out these cameras. So the majority of the nest mounds were in different reserves in Sydney. I had a cluster in Lane Cove National Park and some in Ku-ring-gai National Park, because I was interested in comparing the different animal visitors in different kinds of areas. So I'll play you examples of kind of videos I was observing. This is a nest mound in Clifton Gardens. Brush turkey spots something, and in comes the fox.
Oh.
And these kind of interactions were actually really common. And I found that irrespective of the breeding or non-breeding season, foxes were present at almost every brush turkey mound I looked at in Sydney. This is a totally different kind of interaction. This is a long-nosed bandicoot that is foraging in a brush turkey nest during the night. And it turns out that brush turkey nests are probably providing resources for lots of different animals in both national parks, but also within cities. And they're a convenient place for animals like this to forage for invertebrates and other food. So this is the kind of data I was getting, and it looks at the breakdown of the different visitors in different areas. And as I first hypothesized, there was very different animals visiting nest mounds in national parks versus the urban reserves. So in Ku-ring-gai, we were getting swamp wallabies regularly, lyrebirds, also rats. Lane Cove was kind of intermediate between the two. foxes were becoming more common. You had things like possums, still rats, and in urban reserves, foxes became very common. Almost half of all the visits were foxes, and bandicoots became quite common as well. So this was telling me that even though fox control has been conducted extensively in Sydney, foxes are still present in areas that brush turkeys are in and are still, targeting their nest mounds. So brush turkeys are certainly not free from fox predation. So it's unlikely fox control is the driving force behind why they're spreading so well. So now on to the brush turkey citizen science app that Tom mentioned at the start. So this was funded by the Australian Citizen Science Association, and it was developed by Spotteron, which is a citizen science company based out of Vienna in Austria. And I worked together with Spotteron to look at what kind of data we would like to collect about brush turkeys. And we ran this project for 2.5 years, and we collected over 10,000 brush turkey sightings. You can see the breakdown of sightings of birds versus nest mounds versus their roosts. This is a bit old now, we had actually more than 2,000 users at one point. And we collected more than 2 years of data, which allowed us to start observing seasonal and spatial trends. And I was asked pretty early on, what's the point of another citizen science app? Can't you just get brush turkey data from eBird or iNaturalist or any of the pretty great citizen science projects that are around at the moment? And I'll explain why I think this project was really beneficial to us. And part of it came from the very specific data we were able to collect on brush turkeys. So you can see here me zooming into just a few blocks in Artarmon in northern Sydney, and we can see all these different brush turkey sightings that people have uploaded. And every sighting comes with a count of the number of birds, a date and timestamp, what behaviors were observed, whether the user thought the bird was male or female. And this was the kind of data that it turns out other citizen science projects didn't collect. So we compared the data we were getting to eBird and iNaturalist, which are two pretty well-used citizen science projects. And it turns out that we were getting a bird count, sex, and a behavior in 100% of our sightings. But because it was an option and not required for eBird, only a tiny minority of sightings reports came with this extra information. So while these more general citizen science apps are fantastic for looking at a wide variety of species, we were able to tailor the data we were getting to our specific species and the questions we really wanted to answer. So that's kind of what the data looked like. You have a spike early on as people first catch on to the project, and then a pretty steady seasonal trend. And digging into the data, that's largely driven by an increase in sightings of reproductive related behaviors in the breeding season, starting in July and going on for the next few months. So during these spikes is when the males are building extra mounds and they're displaying, there's a lot more aggression. Brush turkeys just become a lot more visible. And from these sightings, I made a density map of all our brush turkey sightings in Sydney. And this tells me we had the most sightings in the lower North Shore. First, I thought, well, this is pretty surprising because that's right near the middle of the city, really. Why should there be more sightings there than in areas closer to bushland, for example? And it could just be that there are simply more people reporting there. So I plotted all the sightings in the map, and each of these circles is one of our reports. And the bigger the circle, the more brush turkeys were observed at once in that report. So when we remove all the reports of just less than 5 brush turkeys, it turns out there actually is this almost crescent of large numbers of brush turkeys spotted at a given time. So for some reason, when people see brush turkeys, irrespective of how often they see them and how many people are reporting, they on average see more. So for some reason, the population density of brush turkeys really is higher in the North Shore of Sydney. And I was also looking at nest mounds and roosting sites. So each of the red dots is a nest mound, and each of the orange dots is a roosting site. And we can see they are, again, pretty clustered in the North Shore and in the northern beaches. And even though brush turkeys have spread well beyond this sort of border here, the nest sites haven't continued to spread as well. So it could just be that it might take a few years before breeding populations are established further west and further south in Sydney, or it could be those habitats are less suitable for nesting. And that's still to be worked out in the future after we have a few more years of data. So what can I conclude so far from my research? Well, the brush turkey distribution in Sydney has greatly expanded in recent years, and it's a very similar story all along the East Coast. And during this time, they've occupied proportionally more suburban and less vegetated land over time. And in Sydney, their population density seems to be highest in the North Shore. We found that most brush turkeys in urban areas have a very small home range, but individual birds can move at very long distances over short time frames. And we found that brush turkeys in cities have become much bolder and more tolerant of human disturbance than birds in natural areas. We found that brush turkeys have a seasonal effect on the movement and breakdown of leaf litter. So during the breeding season, the intense activity around the nest mound breaks down and moves that leaf litter faster. We found that brush turkeys interact with many other animals, but the species that are interacting with brush turkeys and their nest mounds really varies depending on the habitat between national parks and cities. And correspondingly, we found that foxes are by far the most common nest mound visitor and predator in urban areas. However, the nest mounds themselves may provide food resources for a plethora of other species. So where am I going to go in the future with this research? Well, the Brush Turkeys app has recently been upgraded to the Big City Birds app. And I actually have to thank all of you for this because part of the funding for this was provided very generously by Birding New South Wales. And this has allowed us to combine the Brush Turkeys app and the Wing Tags app, which used to be separate projects, but now you can go to the same platform and report the tagged and untagged birds in the same place. And it's not just me using this app, other researchers are using the platform as well. So you have the option to report other species that we're currently looking at, like sulphur-crested cockadoos, ibis, and little and long-billed corellas. But there's also the option to report any other bird that you choose to. So I'll direct anyone who would love to contribute to my project, and I'd love all of you to do so, to go to the Big City Birds app. And I'll happily talk to anyone about how to do that later on. But before I finish up, I have to talk about brush turkey conservation and management. And this tends to surprise people because I've just spent the entire time saying brush turkeys seem to be spreading in urban areas and they're incredibly successful. So why talk about their conservation? And I have to say that just because an animal is successful in one place, like a city, it doesn't mean that they're successful everywhere. And it's quite possible that the spread of the brush turkey in cities is just masking and compensating for their decline in their natural woodland and rainforest habitat. So the species previously ranged much further south to Jindabyne and much further west to the Pilliga, and they can no longer be found in those areas. So they've largely disappeared from western and southern New South Wales. There also is a current population in the Mandawar and Brigalow Belt regions that is isolated from the rest of the brush turkey population and is currently listed as endangered under state and federal legislation. And some estimates say the population overall has likely declined. And a recent paper I found estimated that their natural habitat has actually decreased by about a third since European colonization. So just because brush turkeys are doing well in cities doesn't mean we can assume the whole species everywhere is thriving. With that in mind, I always like to move on to how can we live peacefully with brush turkeys? Lots of people consider them a nuisance, but given that we can't take their spread for granted, what can we do to minimize their impact on us and minimize our impact on them? And to start off, harming the birds and tampering with active nest mounds is illegal, but there are plenty of things you can do to discourage brush turkeys from making a mess of your garden. And the first thing is if a male starts building a nest mound, you have to clear the nest mound as soon as possible. If you clear it within the first few days, the male will tend to move somewhere else and start again. But if you leave it longer than that, the males seem to keep coming back no matter what you do and will insist on building a nest mound in that area. So clear it as soon as possible if you're going to do that. You can protect your garden beds by covering exposed areas of soil and with things like gravel, pebbles. You can use wire and netting to protect plants. You can use pallets or wood chips or anything that just makes it difficult for brush turkeys to dig in the area. If they find that they're finding it difficult to get into that soil and into that mulch, then it's likely they'll move somewhere else. You can try spraying adults with a hose. That doesn't seem to injure them, it mildly annoys them, and they move on somewhere else. But that's pretty temporary. They will eventually come back. And I wouldn't recommend doing this to chicks. They are a bit more vulnerable to that kind of disturbance. A more long-term way of discouraging brush turkeys is to prune tree cover. They need a certain amount of shade and moisture in the soil in order to build their nest mounds. And if they can't find that, they'll look for another area. Of course, that is an aesthetic choice. To do that, you have to obviously prune your trees and you end up with less cover. So that's a choice between attracting brush turkeys and having maybe the kind of garden that you like. You can also try to avoid leaving food or compost outside. Brush turkeys tend to be attracted to things like pet food or bird feeders or any other food left outside. So avoiding that can help keep brush turkeys away. And lastly, you can try providing an alternative spot for a nest mound. If you have a big enough property and you don't mind brush turkeys, but you wish they would dig in a particular part of your garden and not when you're trying to grow things, you can try leaving a compost pile out for a male to take over later and turn it into a nest mound. If you look online, you might find a few other tips, and this includes, tying up teddy bears like effigies to scare brush turkeys away. And I really don't recommend this because it doesn't. It scares children away when the teddy bears are, nailed to stakes in gardens. And you end up with teddy bears buried in brush turkey mounds. So it doesn't do anything. You might also hear that you can leave out mirrors to distract males because a male will see his reflection and think it's a rival and will try to fight the mirror. And when he can't win, he'll eventually move on. And it's true, this one does work sometimes, but sometimes it can backfire and constantly attract males who are looking for a fight. So it might work for you and it might not. The worst case scenario is you end up with broken glass in your garden and the turkey gets a bit too aggressive. So it's probably not what I'd recommend. So obviously these are pictures of the kind of things which might deter brush turkeys, using tree guards to protect vulnerable new growing plants. If you look at this kind of garden, brush turkeys will find it much more difficult to get through these rocks and able to dig in that mulch. So if you're happy to find that kind of ground cover, it's a good idea. Pallet gardens tend to keep them away because they find it very difficult to get up there and dig between these narrow slots. And I've also heard that if you raise the level of this garden to over their head height, which is about 75 centimeters, they will be less likely to jump on there, and because they can't see that there's actually a convenient place to scratch up there. But this also seems to be a bit hit and miss, and a lot of the time brush turkeys are coming down from above, jumping down from trees or from roofs, so it's not really going to stop them from jumping onto the garden. And I like to finish up with this picture because I think it might be a very geographically and biologically inaccurate print, because I don't think you're never going to find these animals together. But it puts brush turkeys in context, that we should be thinking them as unique Australasian fauna, as iconic as kangaroos and cassowaries, as lyrebirds and the sadly extinct thylacine, because there really is nothing like brush turkeys anywhere else in the world. The brush turkeys and the megapode family are unique to our part of the world, and I think we should be celebrating them as quintessentially Australian fauna. And with that in mind, we should be doing the best we can to try to live alongside them and celebrate the species that have managed to make it and thrive in our human-dominated landscapes. So thank you to everyone for listening to me talk yet again. And I'd like to acknowledge everyone who supported my project, all of you in Birding New South Wales, but also the Australian Citizen Science Association, Spotteron, Taronga Zoo, and the Royal Botanic Gardens have all contributed to my brush turkey project. So are there any questions?
So, okay, well, thank you very much for your talk, Matt. I'd have to say that just listening to it, I'm reminded, I think it was Charles Darwin who said, the most successful species are not the strongest or the most intelligent, but the most adaptable. And I think that's probably true of the brush turkey, even though, as you say, some of their native habitat's been destroyed. I think that certainly they have adapted to the urban habitat extremely well, and some of those other species that you pointed out are being used by the app to track. They have also have that trait in common. So, are there any questions that anybody would like to ask Matt? We can unmute everybody there.
Yes, I'd like to thank Matt very much for the talk. I heard you last year, and I'm in a part of Sydney where there are no brush turkeys, and I really would love to have some. But I remember last year you were talking about how they laid their eggs in their mounds, and the temperatures determined the sex of the babies. And a friend of mine, I told a friend of mine who's a scientist this, and she said, can they have different sexes depending on where in the mound they lay the eggs? And I thought, oh, that's a really good question. I should have asked that. So here I am this year asking.
That is a really good question, and it's something that researchers have looked at before. So Anne Gove, who studied brush turkeys several years before me, she raised them in an incubator and with a temperature gradient. So from, the bottom was the warmest and the top of the incubator was the coolest. And she found that did affect the sex of the chicks. And it's quite likely the same thing will happen in nest mounds as well, because you do get that same kind of temperature gradient. The closer you get to the edge, the cooler it is. And the closer you get to the center, the warmer it is. So I think definitely the position of the egg in the mound will help determine the sex ratio of the clutch at the end.
Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Matthew, thanks very much and congratulations. I also heard your earlier talk and it's great to get an update. I think I must be in the same bush care group as Fran, because we've got a great big nest where the trad has been eradicated within 10 metres of the mound. So we really like it there, not so much in my veggie patch. The question is, you showed the foxes on the mound, but do they prey on the brush turkeys? And does it work the other way in that the foxes are multiplying because there's plenty of food for them and brush turkeys is a key food source?
Foxes don't tend to prey on the adults, but they will absolutely prey on the chicks. So definitely, wherever brush turkeys are, the chicks are probably providing a food source for foxes. Whether they make up a significant enough part of their diet to affect how successful the fox is, I couldn't tell you, unfortunately. But they're definitely a food source.
Therefore, are brush turkey nests a good site for fox baits?
I would say that most likely would be. In almost every urban mound I've looked at, I've seen foxes visiting at some point. So if you are trying to plan fox baiting around brush turkey nests, it's probably worth investigating. I'd hesitate to give a definitive answer of how effective it would be compared to other bait placement techniques, but it's definitely something worth investigating.
Thanks. And just lastly, with your app, I've been a long time turkey app. Do I now transition to the Big Bird app and stop logging on to the turkey app?
Yes, that would be great. We're still collecting the brush turkey sightings. We're trying to get everyone to move to the Big City Birds app as soon as possible.
Is there any more questions? Margaret?
No.
No?
No.
No other questions for Matt?
How long
Okay.
do turkeys live for?
That's a really good question, and unfortunately, we don't know. So the longest a brush turkey was kept in captivity was 17 years.
Well,
And there's birds that were banded in the wild that were observed for at least a decade before that project stopped. But we don't know how long they live. But I'd say it's at least 2 decades.
if they survive their traumatic childhood.
That's right.
And what is their closest relative like biologically, say, in other continents like New Zealand? Are they related to those huge birds in New Zealand, or?
They're not related to birds in New Zealand, but their closest relative is in Papua New Guinea.
Oh yeah, of course, PNG.
They also have birds from the same family in Australia. The malleefowl and the orange-footed scrubfowl are their closest Australian relatives. And they also build the same kind of nest mounds as well. One of my favourite brush turkey relatives lives in Tonga, and we think it might actually be the ancestral way of raising the chicks because they bury their eggs in near volcanic vents. And it's the heat from the volcanoes that actually warms up their eggs for them. And I imagine that kind of environmental heat use probably predates the building of an incubator.
How complex is their vocalization? Like some Australian birds, as you know, have incredibly complex vocal patterns. So how complex is a brush turkey?
Brush turkeys seem to be the opposite of every other Australian bird. Their vocalizations are very limited. They usually only have simple calls for attracting each other's attention and an alarm call they will use when they're being chased by something or been caught by something. But otherwise, they don't tend to be very vocal at all.
Matt, where does the research go from here? Are you continuing with it, or are other people coming up behind you, picking it up and moving on? Or how does it work?
I'm continuing myself for another few months. I'm due to finish my PhD in the end of this year. And I can't possibly extend that any longer.
Right.
So I'm still going to be using mostly the citizen science data we've collected to analyse, where brush turkeys have been sighted in relation to environmental features like the amount of vegetation and different urban features. But after that, the citizen science project itself will keep going after I finish. So there's going to be other researchers who are using that data in the future. So I'd encourage everyone to keep contributing in the long term, because the more data we have in the future about brush turkeys and the other urban bird species, the more questions we'll be able to answer.
Okay, so Matt, where do you go from here once the PhD is done? What sort of area are you going to be looking at in terms of your future career?
That's still an open question for me at the moment. Would very much love to keep going with urban ecology research. It's very likely I'm still going to be involved in the citizen science project, no matter what other role I end up taking, but I'm not wedded or fixed to the idea of research. I'd be quite happy to take other roles, industry or government roles, depending on what's available, really.
Fair enough. That's a reasonably broad spectrum of possible activity, and I think that's great. So any other questions for Matt at the moment?
Matt, can I just come back and ask one question? I had this same problem with the Brush Turkey app. It's not intuitive how to add the spot. Can you give us all a very quick tune on how to add the spot on the map?
Sure. Give me a moment to open up the app on my computer. Maybe I can share my screen.
I have to say that I find that most IT stuff is not intuitive. That's a personal observation.
Okay, so I'll share my screen just to show you the web version of the app. So it's not going to be exactly like the mobile version, but in either the web or the mobile version, you can see an icon that looks like this, and you press that to bring up the add spot window. The first thing to make sure is that this marker on the map is in the correct location. So if I was going to add a sighting to Sydney, for example, I'd find, let's say, Parramatta. I saw a bird there, and I'll make sure the marker is positioned over where I saw the bird. If you're using a mobile phone, it should position automatically if your phone's GPS is on. If it doesn't, you can move the map around manually just by swiping on the screen. So once you've found the location for your sighting, you would click the category. In this case, it would be a brush turkey. Then you have all the different options to add in. So whether it's a tagged or untagged bird, male or female, behavior, and you can add a picture, but that's optional. So once you select all those options, some of them are optional, some are mandatory, you then have the option to save spot, and that would add it to the map.
All right, okay. So once you've filled in all the domains there, the spot will be added. You just see that little flashing icon.
Yes. So if I click save, it will add it to the map right now.
So say I saw it at work today when I'm at home, it doesn't need my GPS because I'm not at the spot now.
That's right. So if that's what you were doing, you'd have to drag the map manually to your location.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And then just save it, and it should be there.
That's right.
Perfect. Just done it. Thanks very much.
No problem. If you have any more questions, you can always email me about that, and I can use screenshots from the mobile version of the app to show you.
Thanks a lot.
No problem.
Okay, so any other questions for Matt at the moment?
How intelligent are these birds? I mean, from your description, they don't, like, say, compared to a magpie, they don't seem to rate it. Could be
Sorry, go ahead.
And I know intelligence is complex, and how do you define it, blah, blah, blah. But
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting question. Traditionally, they weren't considered to be very intelligent birds, and certainly not compared to what magpies can accomplish. Magpies show a level of thinking that's beyond a lot of birds, and definitely brush turkeys. But I think the skill of brush turkeys is more their adaptability rather than their thinking ability. They seem to muddle through whatever behavior they're doing without being disrupted, and that's how they eventually succeed. A good example is males will tend not to understand spatially when they're building a mound if there's something in the way. For example, they will build a mound on one side of a fence and decide they want to drag leaf litter from the other side of the fence. And it never seems to occur to them that they don't have to do that. They can just go and drag material from the other side. But instead, they'll pile up material on the wrong side of the fence and then kick it over. So they seem to survive through determination and adaptability more than their intelligence, I would say.
And they must have to eat a massive amount because they're so big.
They do, and I'd say when I'm watching them in these camera videos, the majority of their time during the day is scratching and eating when they're not, working on their nest mound.
So what do they normally eat?
I've seen them eating everything. So in their natural habitat, it's usually invertebrates and plant parts like fruits or seeds. In city, it will be absolutely anything. They'll happily scavenge, whatever food we leave. They'll chase down small lizards like skinks, and they'll also scavenge off carrion. So if they find a roadkill, they'll try to eat that too.
Right.
So very, very omnivorous diet.
Okay.
Matt, I was walking on a street the other day and watched a brush turkey being mobbed by a whole set of noisy miners. Is this a common thing, or is it just because noisy miners chase everything?
Yeah, it's noisy miners will chase everything. I've seen that several times, and I've actually used noisy miners to help me find brush turkeys when I was trying to tag them, just looking for where the noisy miners were swooping, and I knew the turkey was there.
Okay. Any other questions for Matt? Okay. Well, this has been recorded.
Yes.
And so this talk will be on the website if anybody wants to see it again. And Matt's agreed to that. Thank you very much, Matt. And also some people who've missed perhaps the talk. they might be able to look at it as well. Most of the talks we've had on Zoom are actually on the website now, and that's an advantage, I guess, of this sort of mode of communication. But please, I'd like to thank you, Matt, for taking the time to give us an update, and we look forward to hearing that your thesis has been submitted and accepted, and that you have that PhD after your name, or the doctor before your name.
I'm looking forward to that too.
I'm sure you are. I understand most PhD candidates too. So thank you very much. We appreciate it, and I will communicate with you later about further things.
Thank you all for listening to my talk. Hope you enjoyed it.